The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something is about to happen. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and the faint glow of the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. In a small, peaceful town, a man named Jake walked home from work, unaware that his life was about to change forever. He wasn't alone, though. By his side trotted Max, his loyal German shepherd, a dog who had been more than just a pet. Max was his best friend, his protector, his family. Jake and Max had been inseparable for years. Ever since the day Jake rescued him from the shelter, Max had been fiercely devoted. He seemed to sense when Jake was sad, always nudging him with his nose or curling up beside him on the couch. More than once, Max had stood between Jake and danger, growling at strangers who got too close on late-night walks or barking loudly when something didn't feel right. But nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen that night. As they turned down a quiet alleyway, one Jake always took as a shortcut, Max suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, his body stiffened, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Jake glanced around, but saw nothing unusual. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, patting Max's head. But the dog didn't relax. Instead, he stepped in front of Jake, his body tense, ready for whatever was coming. Then, out of nowhere, chaos erupted. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving fast, too fast for Jake to react. Before he could even process what was happening, Max lunged forward with a fierce snarl. Everything became a blur. A struggle, heavy footsteps, shouts. And then, a sound that made Jake's blood run cold. Max let out a sharp, pained yelp before collapsing to the ground. The world seemed to slow down. Jake fell to his knees beside his best friend, his hands shaking as he reached out to him. "No, no, no," he choked out, his heart hammering. Max's deep brown eyes, always so full of life, stared up at him. His breathing was ragged, weak. The attacker was gone, fled into the darkness, but Jake didn't care. His only focus was Max. He cradled the dog's head in his hands, whispering desperate words. "Stay with me, buddy. Please." But Max's body grew still, his last breath slipping away in Jake's arms. Jake sat there, stunned, as the weight of what had just happened crashed over him. His best friend, his protector, was gone. He felt numb, unable to move, unable to believe this was real. The pain in his chest was unbearable. How could this have happened? How could Max, who had always been the strongest, the bravest, be gone just like that? He barely remembered calling for help, barely registered the sympathetic voices around him. All he knew was the empty ache in his heart. He buried Max the next morning in the backyard, in his favorite spot under the old oak tree where he used to nap in the sunshine. It was the hardest thing Jake had ever done. Days passed, but the house felt empty without the familiar click of Max's paws on the floor, without his excited bark whenever Jake walked through the door. The loneliness was unbearable. Jake didn't just lose a pet, he had lost a part of himself. But just when he thought his world had fallen apart, something happened. Something so unbelievable that it defied all logic. It started with a sound, faint but unmistakable. A bark. Jake sat up in bed, his heart pounding. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But then, there was again. A bark right outside his window. His breath caught in his throat as he slowly got up and walked to the door. His hands trembled as he turned the handle, stepping outside into the cool night air. And that's when he saw it. Jake's eyes widened, his pulse racing, because standing there, in the moonlight, was a familiar silhouette, one he never thought he'd see again. And at that moment, he realized Max's story wasn't over yet. Jake's breath hitched as he took a shaky step forward, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. The silhouette in the moonlight, the familiar shape of a dog standing just a few feet away. He knew it was impossible. It couldn't be Max. Max was gone. He had buried him with his own hands. And yet, the dog standing before him had the same sturdy build, the same familiar markings, the same deep brown eyes that had always been filled with loyalty and love. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. "Max," he whispered, barely able to say the name. The dog didn't move at first. He just stood there, watching Jake, as if waiting for something. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The night was still, almost too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. Then, slowly, the dog took a step forward. Jake's chest tightened. His heart told him it was Max, but his mind screamed that it was impossible. His best friend had died in his arms. He had felt the life leave Max's body. He had grieved, buried him, mourned him. And yet, here he was standing right in front of him, solid and real. Jake's feet felt rooted to the ground. He wanted to rush forward, to throw his arms around Max, to convince himself that this was real. But fear crept in. What if this wasn't Max? What if his grief was playing tricks on him? As if sensing his hesitation, the dog let out a soft whimper, the exact same sound Max used to make when he wanted comfort. That was all it took. Jake dropped to his knees, his eyes burning. Is it really you? His voice cracked with emotion as he reached out a trembling hand. The dog closed the distance, pressing his head into Jake's chest. The warmth of his fur, the weight of his body, it was all real. Jake felt his throat tighten as he wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in his thick coat. He could feel the rise and fall of his breathing, hear the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Tears welled up in Jake's eyes. It was him. Somehow, someway Max had come back. But how? Jake pulled back slightly, searching the dog's eyes for answers. Max's gaze was steady, filled with the same love and devotion that had always been there. But there was something else, something deeper, almost knowing. Jake couldn't explain it, but he felt it in his gut. This wasn't just a random miracle. Something had happened. Jake ran his hands over Max's fur, checking for any sign of injury, any clue that could explain what was going on. There was nothing, no wounds, no scars, no evidence that he had ever been hurt at all. It was as if the attack that had taken Max's life had never happened. A chill ran down Jake's spine. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in the impossible. But none of this made sense. His mind raced through every logical explanation. Maybe he had been mistaken that night. Maybe, in his grief, he had convinced himself that Max was gone when he had only been unconscious. But no, that wasn't possible. He had felt the stillness in Max's body. He had buried him. And yet, here he was. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He needed answers. But more than that, he needed to know if this was real. "Come on, buddy," he said softly, rising to his feet. "Let's go inside." Max followed without hesitation, trotting beside him just like he always had. The familiarity of it sent another wave of emotion crashing over Jake. He had thought he would never feel this again, this sense of companionship, of safety, of unconditional love. Inside, the house was quiet, dimly lit by the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the windows. Jake shut the door behind them, still half expecting this to all be some strange dream that would vanish the moment he blinked. But Max was still there, standing in the middle of the living room, looking around like he had never left. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to collect his thoughts. He grabbed his phone from the table, scrolling through his call log. There was the call to the vet, the arrangements he had made. He wasn't imagining what had happened. Max was supposed to be gone. His hands felt clammy as he turned back to his dog. Max was sitting now, watching him with patient eyes, waiting, just like he always did. Jake crouched down, rubbing his hands over his face. "Okay," he muttered. "I need to figure this out." He looked up at Max again, searching for some kind of sign, anything that could help him understand. "Where have you been?" Max didn't respond, of course. But as Jake watched him, he noticed something strange. The dog's posture was different, more alert, more aware. It was subtle, but it was there. Max wasn't just his old self. There was something else, something almost unnatural. Jake's stomach twisted. What if this wasn't just about Max coming back? What if something bigger was happening? A sudden knock at the door made him jump. Max's ears perked up, his body tensing slightly. Jake's heart pounded as he stood up, crossing the room. He hadn't been expecting anyone. And at this hour, it didn't make sense. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and pulling it open. A man stood on the porch, his face partially hidden in the dim light. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his expression unreadable. Jake swallowed hard. "Can I help you?" The man studied him for a moment before speaking. I need to ask you something, he said, his voice calm but firm. Has anything unusual happened tonight? Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. He glanced back at Max, who was now standing protectively by his side, his gaze locked onto the stranger. Jake turned back to the man. Who are you? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes flickering toward Max. That dog, he said quietly. He wasn't supposed to come back. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct in his body screamed that something was very, very wrong. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears as the stranger's words sank in. He wasn't supposed to come back. His grip on the doorknob tightened. A cold unease crept over him, twisting in his gut. How did this man know about Max? Who was he? Max let out a low growl, stepping closer to Jake, his body tense. His reaction only made Jake more certain. This man wasn't just some curious neighbor or passerby. He knew something, and whatever it was, Jake wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. The man kept his gaze steady, waiting for a response. Jake swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I think you have a wrong house. The man's eyes flickered, like he was measuring Jake's reaction. He let out a quiet breath and nodded once, as if coming to a decision. If he's back, you need to be careful. His tone was flat, but there was something beneath it, something that sent another chill down Jake's spine. Jake narrowed his eyes. What? The man hesitated, glancing at Max again before taking a step back. Because things like this don't just happen. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night like he had never been there at all. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, staring after him, his heart still hammering. He wanted to call out, demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat. Nothing about this felt right. Max pressed against his leg, his presence grounding Jake for a moment. He looked down at his dog, still struggling to process everything. Max was here, alive, breathing, and yet, a stranger had just shown up at his door, warning him about something he didn't understand. Jake exhaled shakily, shutting the door and locking it. His mind was racing, running through every possibility, but none of them made sense. He turned back to Max, who was still watching the door, ears alert. You're not telling me something, are you, buddy? He murmured, rubbing his fingers through Max's fur. Max didn't respond, of course, but something in his eyes, something Jake couldn't quite put into words, made him feel like the dog did understand, like there was something bigger going on beneath the surface. That night, Jake barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in knots. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the stranger's face, heard his voice repeating those haunting words. He wasn't supposed to come back. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, Jake had made up his mind. He needed answers. The first thing he did was check the backyard, the grave. He had to see it for himself. With Max trotting beside him, he made his way to the old oak tree, his stomach twisting in knots. The ground should have been undisturbed, the dirt packed down from where he had buried Max days ago. But as soon as Jake got closer, his breath caught in his throat. The ground wasn't how he had left it. The dirt was uneven, like it had been disturbed recently. His chest tightened. Someone, or something, had been here. Jake knelt down, running his fingers through the soil. It was loose, freshly moved. He dug in, heart pounding, and then he hit something. His breath hitched. He pulled back more dirt, his fingers trembling. And then he saw it. His stomach turned. A collar. Max's old collar. The one he had buried him with. But no body. Jake rocked back on his heels, his mind spinning. The grave was empty. Max's body was gone. He stared at the disturbed earth, trying to make sense of it. Had someone dug him up? Had the stranger at the door known this would happen? Jake's heart pounded as he looked at Max, who was sitting calmly beside him, as if none of this was strange. But it was strange. It was impossible. Max wasn't supposed to be here, but he was. Jake's fingers curled around the old collar, his breath uneven. If Max's body was gone, then what was standing beside him? The thought made his skin prickle. He didn't want to doubt it. He felt like Max. He acted like Max. But Jake couldn't ignore what was happening. Something was wrong, and he needed to find out what. He got up, brushing the dirt off his hands, his mind already spinning with possibilities. He needed to retrace his steps. The night Max had died, the attack. Maybe there was something he missed. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he scrolled through his contacts until he found the one person who might have some insight, Sarah. Sarah had been his friend since college. She was sharp, skeptical, and never one to believe in anything supernatural. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it was her. He hesitated for only a moment before hitting call. She picked up after a few rings. "Jake? What's up?" He exhaled. "I need to talk to you. In person. It's weird." A pause. "Weird how?" "I don't even know how to explain it over the phone," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Just, can you meet me at the diner? The one by Main Street." Another pause. "Then, yeah, I'll be there in an hour." Jake hung up, glancing at Max, who was still sitting there, watching him. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. "Let's get some answers." As they walked back inside, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever had happened that night, whatever had brought Max back, wasn't over. And deep down, he knew the truth was something he wasn't ready for. Jake sat at the diner, his fingers drumming restlessly against the edge of the table. The scent of coffee and warm food filled the air, but he had no appetite. His mind was spinning with questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. Across from him, Max sat calmly on the floor, his steady presence grounding Jake in a way nothing else could. But that didn't change the truth. Max wasn't supposed to be here. Sarah arrived a few minutes later, sliding into the seat across from Jake with a concerned look. "All right," she said, setting her bag down. "You sounded weird on the phone. What's going on?" Jake exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "I need you to just hear me out, and don't call me crazy." Sarah raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Okay." Jake hesitated, glancing down at Max. The dog was watching him, patient as ever, as if waiting for him to speak. Finally, Jake took a deep breath and told her everything. The attack, Max's death, burying him, only to have him show up at his doorstep days later, alive and unharmed. He even told her about the stranger at his door, the empty grave, the collar he had found buried in the dirt. Sarah didn't interrupt. She just listened, her expression unreadable. But when Jake finally finished, she let out a slow breath and leaned back in her chair. "Okay," she said. "That's a lot." Jake let out a humorless laugh. "Tell me about it." Sarah tapped her fingers on the table, thinking. "All right, let's start with the obvious. Are you absolutely sure it's him? Not just a dog that looks like him?" Jake shook his head. "It's him, Sarah. I know my dog. He remembers me. He acts exactly like he always did." She studied Max, who tilted his head slightly at her. "But you said his grave was empty?" Jake nodded. "Completely." Sarah sighed. "This doesn't make any sense." Jake leaned in. "I know, and that's what scares me." Sarah was quiet for a moment before she asked, "What about the guy who showed up at your door? What did he look like?" Jake frowned, thinking back. "Tall, dark hair, kind of cold, like he knew something I didn't. He said Max wasn't supposed to come back." Sarah's eyes darkened. "And then he just left?" "Yeah." She shook her head. "That's weird." Jake laughed under his breath. "That's the weird part." Sarah gave him a look, but didn't argue. Instead, she pulled out her phone. "I think we need to figure out if anyone else has experienced something like this. Maybe it's not just you." Jake watched as she searched online, scrolling through pages of results. Her expression grew more serious the longer she looked. "Jake," she murmured after a moment, turning her phone toward him. "Look at this." Jake leaned in. The screen showed an old article from a few years ago. The headline sent a chill down his spine. "Dog found alive after being buried. Owner claims it's not the same." Jake's mouth went dry. What does it say?" Sarah scrolled down. "It happened in a different state, but it's eerily similar. A guy lost his dog, buried it, and a week later, the dog came back. No injuries, no explanation. But here's the thing, he swore something was off. The dog acted like his, but he started noticing things. It wouldn't sleep. It never ate. And it would just stare at him." Jake felt his skin prickle. Sarah kept reading. He tried to ignore it, but he said he started waking up in the middle of the night to find the dog standing over him, just watching. She looked up at Jake. He said he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really his dog. Jake swallowed hard, glancing at Max. His heart pounded. No, this wasn't the same. Max was normal. He was eating. He was sleeping. Wasn't he? His thoughts raced. Had he actually seen Max eat? Had he noticed him sleeping? Jake's mind reeled. Sarah was still reading. The article doesn't say what happened next, just that the guy disappeared. Jake's stomach clenched. Disappeared. Sarah nodded, setting her phone down. Vanished without a trace. No one ever found him. Jake leaned back, running a shaky hand through his hair. This is insane. Sarah exhaled. I don't know, Jake, but whatever this is, I think you need to be careful. Jake nodded slowly, his thoughts swirling. He looked down at Max, who was sitting there, silent and still. Watching, Jake suddenly felt cold. That night, he kept a closer eye on Max. Every movement, every sound. He needed to convince himself that everything was normal, that this was still his dog. Hours passed. The house was quiet. Max lay by the couch, seemingly asleep. Jake watched him for a long time, his heart heavy with uncertainty. But then, at some point in the middle of the night, Jake woke with a jolt. A strange feeling sat heavy in his chest. The room was dark, too still. Something was wrong. And then he saw it. Max, not lying down, not asleep, standing in the middle of the room, watching him. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The shadows stretched across the walls, making Max's shape look even darker, almost unnatural. He wasn't moving. He was just staring. A wave of unease crashed over Jake. Max, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The dog didn't respond, didn't wag his tail, didn't blink. Jake felt his stomach twist. And then, Max took a single step forward. A slow, deliberate step. Jake's pulse skyrocketed. Something was wrong. Something was deeply wrong. And then Max did something that made Jake's blood run cold. He smiled. Not a dog smile. Not the happy, tongue-out expression Jake had seen 100 times before. A real, human-like smile. Jake's body went rigid. His breath caught in his throat. His dog, if it even was his dog, was grinning at him in the dark. A feeling of pure, icy terror wrapped around Jake's spine. Max took another step forward, and Jake knew whatever had come back wasn't Max. Not anymore. Jake couldn't move. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow as he stared at the thing standing in front of him. His dog, his best friend, was smiling in a way no dog ever should. It was wrong, unnatural. Something deep in Jake's gut screamed at him to run, to get as far away as possible. But his legs wouldn't move. His body felt frozen, locked in place by fear. Max, or whatever this was, tilted his head, watching Jake carefully. The room was too quiet. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen but deeply unsettling. Jake's mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation. Maybe he was dreaming. Maybe this was all just some horrible nightmare, and he would wake up any second now. But then Max took another step forward. Slow, purposeful, and Jake knew this was real. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Max, he whispered again, his voice barely audible. It was a desperate attempt, a final hope that somehow his dog would snap out of this, that everything would go back to normal. But Max didn't move like a dog anymore. Jake swallowed hard. He needed to get out. Now, summoning every ounce of strength he had, he forced himself to move. His body jolted as he pushed back, stumbling off the couch and nearly falling. His foot caught on a rug, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He rushed toward the hallway, fumbling for the light switch, but his hands were shaking too much. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of paws moving across the hardwood floor. Slow, unhurried, like whatever was inside Max knew Jake had nowhere to go. Jake's fingers finally found the switch. Light flooded the room. Max stopped. Jake's breath hitched. For the first time, something in Max's expression changed. The eerie, unnatural calm was gone, replaced by something else, something almost angry. Jake took another step back. What are you? He forced out. Max didn't answer. Of course he didn't. But Jake wasn't waiting to find out. He turned and bolted toward the front door, his heart hammering. He didn't care that he was barefoot, didn't care that he had no plan. All that mattered was getting out. He reached for the doorknob. But before he could turn it, a deep growl rumbled behind him. It was a sound he had never heard before. Low, guttural, wrong. Jake's body went rigid. He didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at him to just run. But before he could react, the air shifted. A cold chill rushed through the room, making his skin prickle. And then, a voice. Not a bark, not a growl. A voice. Soft, almost familiar, but layered with something else. Something ancient. Something that didn't belong. You should not have brought me back. Jake's blood ran cold. His stomach lurched, nausea twisting through him. He couldn't breathe. This wasn't Max. It had never been Max. Terror gripped his chest, but somewhere beneath it, deep, buried under all the fear, was something else. Anger. Jake had lost Max once. He had mourned, grieved, accepted the loss. And now something had stolen his face, had invaded his home, pretending to be something it wasn't. Jake's hand clenched into a fist. His fear didn't disappear, but something steadier took its place. Determination. He turned, forcing himself to meet the thing's eyes. The creature wearing Max's body stared back, its head tilted in an almost curious way. Jake's voice was hoarse, shaking, but firm. You don't belong here. For a moment, silence stretched between them. And then something shifted. Max's body trembled, like something inside was struggling, pushing against itself. The room seemed to darken, the air thick with something unseen but suffocating. Jake took a step forward. His heart was still pounding, but he didn't stop. You don't belong here, he repeated, stronger this time. The thing inside Max let out a low, guttural sound, half growl, half something Jake couldn't describe. But its body kept shaking like it was fighting something. And then, a sudden, sharp whimper. Jake froze. For the briefest second, Max's eyes changed. The eerie stillness disappeared, replaced by something raw. Pain. Fear. Jake's breath caught. Max, he whispered. The creature let out a choked sound. Its legs buckled. Its body trembled violently. And then, a gust of cold air swept through the room. Jake stumbled back as the lights flickered, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. The air felt thick, electric, humming with something Jake didn't understand. And then, it was gone. Max collapsed onto the floor. Jake's breath hitched. He hesitated only a second before rushing forward, dropping to his knees beside his dog. Max! His hands trembled as he reached out, pressing against his fur. Buddy, come on. Wake up. For a terrible, endless moment, nothing happened. Then, a slow inhale. Max's chest rose, and then his eyes blinked open. Jake let out a shaky breath, his throat tight. Oh God, Max! Max blinked at him, his ears twitching. And then, slowly, weakly, his tail wagged. Jake let out a half laugh, half sob, pulling his dog close. He didn't know what had just happened. He didn't know how it had happened. But Max was here. Really here, and whatever had been inside him was gone. In the days that followed, Jake tried to make sense of it all. He and Sarah searched for answers, but there was nothing, no logical explanation, no reasoning behind what had happened. It was as if the world itself had no record of the nightmare he had lived through. But it didn't matter. Max was back, and this time he was really Max. Jake didn't need to understand the how or the why. All that mattered was that he had his best friend back. And as he watched Max chase a squirrel across the backyard, barking happily, tail wagging, Jake knew one thing for certain. Some miracles didn't need explanations. Some were simply meant to be.